And so I want to turn to the panel and ask this question around inclusive leadership, and really what is your view on the board chair's role of bringing that to the board and then taking this to the next level?
You know, it's funny when you're talking about leadership. I was giving a talk at Rotman last evening about leadership, and I had a definition that came from sort of the 1920s, and the definition said a leader is a person who directs men. And I thought, well, okay, first of all, it probably was written by a woman if it says that, but and then the more recent definitions use words like influence, inspire, coach, mentor, listen, all of those words, which are much softer. And that really is the change of a board chair. I mean, not that long ago, the board chair was also the CEO, and also, you know, he was in charge. There was no question. He was in charge of management, he was in charge of the board, and his word carried the day. That role has changed greatly, first by splitting the CEO and chair role, and secondly, just by the times and more study of leadership, et cetera. So what's a board chair's role? Well, they're to get the best out of each director so that collectively they are enhancing the performance of the organization. I mean, that's pretty clear. And so the chair really needs to understand that diversity of thought around the table is an advantage. It's not a disadvantage. It's not, I mean, it used to be in the old days, you know, oh, Harry always brings up that darn thing, and that's his pet peeve, and, you know, we ignore him about that. But they really listen, they're open to different ideas, and they're hearing it, and they see that as an advantage over the next group that doesn't have that thing. So, you know, in a way, you could say they've got to be courageous, because it's going to change. It has to change. And so, you know, hats off to the chairs that can embrace this quickly to give their company an advantage. One thing I'd also say is that, you know, I don't think people should be patting themselves on the back and saying, oh, well, we've now got a woman on the board. Because what happens then is that person is looked at as bringing the woman's perspective, and that's not what we're looking. That's not what boards should be looking for. They're looking for diversity of thought, and so that's why teachers had in its position is that you should have 3 women who are on the board, and when that happens, and in the boards I've sat on, once you got above 3 or more women on the board, you stopped looking at them as women. They started saying, no, I'm interested in your views. I'm interested in what you can bring to the table regardless of your gender. And it becomes gender blind thereafter.
It was interesting when Alison Conrad from the Ivey School of Business authored that study. It was about 8 or 10 years ago. And she concluded from her research that the minimum should be 3, that was the right number, to your point, Jim. And I've had so many board chairs and directors tell me that when, and especially women who are directors, when they've hit that number 3, that it changes the board, that it changes the kind of dialogue and changes the tone of the discussion, and that it's been very, very positive for boards and for the businesses that they run. And Shannon, I think you've had a similar...
Yeah, you've heard me tell that story for sure. So I'll tell a Deloitte story again. I guess in that 2 years ago, the board chair of the global Deloitte entity recognized that gender diversity was not happening at our global board. We had many other elements of diversity, mostly because the countries are represented on this board. But it was very hard to bring women onto the board because typically CEOs and chairs of the member firms filled those seats. So what the board chair initiated was that the 5 countries who had more than 1 board seat would change one of their board members, replace the CEO representative for a female from their firm. And so Canada was one of those countries, and our CEO, Frank Vitis, was very supportive of this and asked me to replace him on that board. So I've been able to sit on the global board for the last 2 years for this reason. Through that time was, of course, preoccupied with learning the board and what the business of that board was. But I was very interested to hear a year later the board members speaking about the board and the performance of the board, and they were quite pleased with that. They thought the board performance was improving, and so of course curiosity got the better of me, and I asked, why is it you feel what's happening? And they said, well, actually, we think it's the women. The addition of the women, and particularly I think because it was 5 women, like from one meeting to the next, all of a sudden there was 5 new women. There were 2, so now there were 7. And what I didn't appreciate, not having been there before, was that the dialogue did change. And over that year, everyone felt more included. Bigger countries, smaller countries had equal voice. There was actually more challenge to management, and the outcome was they felt they had performed better. So I'm a student of this. I study these, I read tons of articles about this, and so I'm actually surprised that I was surprised. But it's very true. When you hit that critical point, and maybe it's 3 is the magic number, I happen to experience 5, it does in fact change the dialogue, and it creates a notion that, you're right, Jim, you're not the female voice, you're one of many voices, and you stimulate a different type of dialogue, and it helps everyone. So that's quite important. I wouldn't mind going back to pick up on the inclusive leadership piece, because Pamela, you teach a lot of board chairs. You teach courses that impact the board chair and their skill development. What are you seeing in terms of a need there, and what you think is best for the board chair of the future?
So in our corporate governance education program, we have a new module called Leading in the Boardrooms of Tomorrow. And the reason we created and launched this new module was, to your point, Jim, around how the role of a board chair has changed and what makes a good board chair in 2015. And I think there's just now a really great realization that culture is so key, that if a company does not have a kind of culture that is inclusive, obviously it's going to be very difficult for that company to recruit and retain diverse managers and executives. And so in the boardrooms of tomorrow, we focus on that, on being inclusive, and how a board chair can be inclusive in the boardroom, and how the executive team can be inclusive with respect to the culture that is created, and how individuals can be assessed, taking away bias, which is easily creeping into performance evaluations. So it's that board chair, and ultimately the board itself, that's really responsible for making sure the DNA of the organization is good. And if that DNA of that organization is not good, then changing it so that the best and the brightest people are in that company and are staying there in that company to build shareholder value.
Right. Yeah, very true. And Maureen, what's your take on the leadership piece of this?
Well, I think this whole debate is about leadership. There is nothing more demotivating for incredible executive talent to go into a boardroom that's not inspirational.
Yeah.
And there's nothing more demotivating for your succession, what did you call them, Jim, swim lanes?
Swim lanes.
To have these incredible talented people be told, well, don't worry about it, this is what you're going to do, in like non-inspirational leadership. I think the companies that are going to be most successful are the ones that really inspire their staff, invest in them, really take succession planning not as a perfunctory exercise, but really to invest in what you see as the future leadership. And I think they need to see all the way through an organization, they need to see that tone at the top and that inspirational leadership, and that's what keeps people loyal to organizations.
And we all know for employees, when they look up, the question is, do they see themselves? So if someone is at the VP level, they look up to the SVP level. Do they see themselves? But when they look up to the board, especially for women, if they're really underrepresented on the board, women are going to ask themselves, is this the kind of company where I want to be? So I think that goes back to the board chair discussion a few minutes ago, doesn't it, Jim? About
For
the
sure.
role of the board chair.
Yep.
What about the other elements of diversity? This is, focused on women in these positions, but certainly when we want to be inclusive, we want to be broadly inclusive. And just what are your reactions to that as we focus a bit on the discussion about women? Are we taking our eye off the other elements of diversity and we shouldn't?
I'd like to respond to that. We really thought long and hard before we introduced this instrument about this. Diversity of thought is what we're trying to achieve at the board table and in senior management. And I think that one of the ways that you can do that is you start with some focus. And so we really talked a lot about, should it be a broader diversity focus or women on boards? And we were very focused on the women on boards simply because we thought any changes that we made around reporting and around changing the discussion at the board table and at the senior management table, all of those changes would open up a broader discussion of diversity within corporations. And so I think it's, a gender diversity is easily identifiable, and it's 50% of the population. So if you start with this and you start broadening the discussion, the rest of diversity is going to have a much more welcoming entry to that board table as well.
And for the Canadian Board Diversity Council, we supported very much the OSC's focus, together with the other securities regulators, and the federal government's focus, and the province of Ontario's focus, because we did feel that, practically speaking, that kind of focus would lead to change with respect to women on boards and executive officer positions, and that therefore would influence the changes that would happen with respect to visible minorities and Aboriginal leaders.
I don't think my position is much different than my colleagues. You can eat this elephant one bite at a time. I think if we tried to eat the whole elephant at once, we'd choke on it and we wouldn't make any progress. As I said in my remarks, my expectation is that by 2020, this issue's off the table, and the boards will have started to embrace the concept of diversity of voice, diversity of thought around the table is clearly enhancing our performance. So I think you start with what should be the easiest, the most obvious, and much the same as the debate between chair and chief executive officer. You just don't hear that debate in Canada anymore. Whereas I remember when that was first introduced, it was, oh my gosh, the world was going to come to an end,
right.
and
It's the
businesses
death
were going to crash.
Death of the corporation.
That's right. So, look at the advantages that we've gotten out of that over the last number of years. I think people by 2020 will realize this is a non-issue. We've got, our board is performing better. It'll be different. It's performing better, and our corporation is performing better.
So how, maybe one sort of piece of advice around the balance, because I think as a board chair right now, the toughest balance must be getting diversity of voice, like you just articulated. And you mentioned earlier, still though the demand side is saying fit into the culture. And those are tension points, right, that the board leader has to courageously move into. And I guess, is there just a snapshot of advice you'd give somebody to how to shake that one up a bit?
Well, okay, so I'm going to tell a story about two fishermen.
Okay.
And the two fishermen head out, and it's one beautiful morning, and they go to this pond and they cast their lines and they start to pull out some great fish, and then the next couple hours the fish get smaller and smaller, and then one of them says to the other one, I hear there's this other great pond over there. Let's go and check that out. And they amble over to this pond and they start fishing there. And wow, the fish, they're coming out. They're really big fish and they're really happy about that. So I think board chairs and nominating and governance committee chairs need to think about fishing in more than one pond in order to identify great directors of tomorrow.
Very good. And what do you say to the folks who say there's just too much talk on diversity, you're going too far, over-rotating on diversity? What's your reaction to that?
I can't understand it. We're actually starting to see an evolution of diversity of thought at the board table. But it's not that long ago that we had cosmetic companies who did not have a single woman on the board, where we had outdoor equipment companies that did not have anyone on their board that either had ever been in a canoe or used skis or snowshoes. It's just unthinkable. How can you have a retail company that retails to babies and not have a single mother on that board? And I would just say that I think you have to really not just understand the culture, but what this company does. And there has to be some tie to wanting this company to be a good performer. And I think that diversity of thought and that connection with the mandate of the company is absolutely critical to have good performing companies.
I think people who criticize it as, potential of over-rotating, they haven't embraced the idea that diversity of thought around the table is a strategic advantage. And I think they just got to get there. My advice to a board chair who is saying, I think, who has seen the possibilities and says this is the way we should go, and perhaps doesn't have the rest of the board there yet, I say just go for it. The world is not going to come to an end, and all of a sudden, even your naysayers are going to say within 24 months, that changes pretty good.
That's good. Do we run the risk of a tiebreaker, each gender there lined up to the final two spots, and it's an automatic win for the woman? Is that a risk that's out there, or do you think what's really happening out there?
Merit.
Merit.
It's all about merit,
That's
right?
right.
It's all about business.
So the pipeline, the preparation, the processes, all the things that you've talked about get you to your short list that truly where you can move forward with
A
merit.
short list that has diverse candidates on it.
And enables the governance committee.
And that's
to
why
then-
I'm
yeah.
not surprised that in the findings in the reports you got from reporting companies that they didn't say we have a quota that we're saying it's merit. Because I think in the last moment it is merit. But the question is, how many pools are you fishing in?
That's right.
Let's
Yeah.
expand the pool so that at the end you have choice as opposed to a 6'2" white male.